Hey everybody, this is Cody Hoelscher with the Solomon Group at Coldwell Banker Action. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about old, outdated, and potentially dangerous electrical systems that you might find in a home. So maybe you're looking at purchasing a home, maybe you already own a home. Either way, stick around for the whole video because all these points are very important and good to look out for. So without further ado, let's get started with number one. Number one is going to be the Stab Lock electrical panel by Federal Pacific. So Federal Pacific manufactured electrical panels for a lot of the years. The Stab Lock panels were very popular. They started making them in the 1950s and they ran them all the way through the 1980s. It was discovered in the early 90s after some investigations and some lawsuits that these panels did not properly trip when they were overloaded. And so the risk to you is that if you have one of these panels, you overload the circuit, it doesn't trip, it can actually start a house fire. And you can look it up online, you can see the history of the company, you can see the history of the lawsuits, and you can see that unfortunately quite a few people lost their houses because of these panels. And unfortunately, because they were manufactured for so many years, we do still see them quite a bit. They're definitely not uncommon to find in houses. And so if you see a Federal Pacific panel in the house that you're buying, what should you do? I always recommend, if you have one of these types of panels in the house that you're buying, that you definitely get it upgraded to a newer panel immediately after you purchase the home. It's definitely not something you want to play around and wait on. You want to get it upgraded to a new panel right away by a licensed electrician. And if you're in a position where you can negotiate that repair prior to closing, even better. And two, on top of this, if you have an FHA loan, a VA loan, or some other type of loan programs, they may actually require that you fix it or escrow for that repair. So depending on your type of situation, these panels can cause a bit of an issue in the deal, but usually we are able to work through that. So that's going to be it for Federal Pacific panels. Moving on to number two, we're going to be talking about old fuse boxes. Now I have a picture of a fuse box above my shoulder. Some of my older audience members, you guys probably remember growing up, the fuse would pop, mom and dad would go in the basement, they'd grab a new fuse and pop it in, and you would be good to go. Functionally, these panels are not actually terrible. They work pretty well. But we have a newer and better system. Obviously, it's much more convenient just to go downstairs or to your electrical panel, flip it on and off, and you're good to go. Versus, back then having to replace the fuse. In addition to that, it can be difficult to find fuses to replace if a fuse blows. The parts just aren't that common anymore because there's not very many of these in service anymore. And so if you do have one of these older fuse boxes, it is something you'll want to look at getting upgraded to a normal breaker panel, again by a licensed electrician. Now moving on to number three is going to be old 60 amp service. Typically in new homes today, or even homes that have had upgraded service, you'll see either 200 amp or 100 amp service. Either or of these are fine depending on your energy consumption and your needs. Typically, newer builds are going to be 200 amp service. The older builds built prior to, I would say, 1990, 1980 are going to be 100 amp service, but it does depend on the house. But if you go further back than that, you will see a lot of 60 amp service. And back in the day, that was totally fine. In the 40s, the 50s, the energy usage for the average household wasn't that much. And so that was enough power to suffice for the house. But as we've grown, our energy needs have increased. We consume more power. 200 amp or 100 amp power is typically what is needed to power the average American home. And so if you have an older house with the older 60 amp service, you'll want to look at having a licensed electrician come in and upgrade the panel to either a 100 amp or a 200 amp panel. Most people are going to opt for the 200 amp panel just because it is more desirable to have that capability in your panel, but a 100 amp panel is typically fine for a majority of houses unless your energy needs are higher. That licensed electrician will also coordinate with WPS to bring in a proper 200 amp or 100 amp line depending on what your energy needs are. And that's going to be it for the older 60 amp panel. Moving on to number 4, which is knob and tube wiring. Knob and tube wiring was first used in residential applications in the late 1800s. It was the first type of wiring used in residential applications, and they used it all the way until the 1940s. The issue is the coating that's on the outside of the wiring does not hold up well with time. It can become frail, it can flake off, and this can become a safety and a fire hazard. If you have some older knob and tube, maybe in your attic space, and that coating has come off or it's become damaged, it's a huge fire hazard. In addition to that, if you have knob and tube in open and exposed areas like your basement, outside maybe, it's a shock hazard if you were to touch it and that coating is damaged, or you bump something onto it and it becomes damaged, and then it's a fire hazard. So either way, if you have older knob and tube wiring, it can actually be fixed by a licensed electrician with newer Romex wire. It's not the end of the world, but it is something that you should be aware of, and if it's in exposed or dangerous areas, it is something that you want to get fixed sooner rather than later. So that's going to wrap up today's video talking about some of the older electricity and systems you'll find in houses today. If you have any questions on these specifically, or you want your house to be looked at, I would definitely call a licensed electrician. They're going to be able to bring in the knowledge and give you the best fix. I'm just a realtor, so I know some general things about electricity. But again, if you're going to have work done or you want a professional opinion, those are the people to call. And as always, if you guys have any questions or maybe you have a future topic idea, feel free to leave a comment or personal message me, and we'll catch you guys in the next video.